Okay, well, after Reza Khalili, I'm somewhat reminded, listening to him, of that wonderful scene in Play It Again, Sam, that Woody Allen movie. He's at the Whitney or MoMA, and he's looking around, and he sees this attractive woman staring at a Jackson Pollock. He says, okay, I'm going to make my move, goes up to her, and he says, "Lovely Pollock, what do you think of it?" And she says, "It restates the negativeness of the universe, the hideous, lonely emptiness of existence, nothingness, the predicament of man forced to live in a barren, godless eternity, like a tiny flame flickering in an immense void with nothing but waste, horror, and degradation, forming a useless, bleak straitjacket in a black, absurd cosmos." And Woody Allen looks at her and says, "What are you doing Saturday night?" She says, "Committing suicide." He says, "What are you doing Friday night?" I am deeply honored to be here, deeply honored to be in such distinguished company. There are so many people here, but I can't help myself. The fact that Ben Carson is here is amazingly exciting. You know, Dr. Carson, the Wall Street Journal has not endorsed anyone for president formally in more than 80 years. We were burned by that Hoover endorsement back in 28. But let me tell you, we were this close, pal. We were this close. It's also a great honor for me to be receiving a Speaker of Truth award or recognition. The older I get, and 39 feels old to me. The older I get, the more I realize some people think that's old in this room. It's not all fuddy-duddies here. The older I get, I realize that truth is like those rare earth elements you sometimes read about with names like scandium and thulium and yttrium, that are essential parts of many of the electronic gadgets that we all use. They're extremely hard to find, extremely hard to extract, extremely hard to process, extremely hard to distribute, and extremely hard to install. And yet, without them, modern civilization as we know it falls to pieces. Now, today I want to take a few minutes to speak about this rare and stubborn element called truth, and how it relates in particular to politics in the Middle East, and maybe more particularly toward the modern state of Israel. Because it seems to me that nowhere else in the world are the issues at stake so connected to the defense not of an ideology, nor of an interest, nor even of a country, but to the question of truth itself. Because when Israel is accused, for instance, of being an apartheid state, or when it is accused, as it was by the Goldstone report, of war crimes, or when it is alleged that Israel murdered Egyptian POWs in the Sinai in 1967, or when it is claimed that Israel deliberately targeted innocent civilians in Gaza or Lebanon in more recent wars, when these accusations are leveled time and again, often maliciously and often mindlessly, until they become part of an anti-Israel narrative that is supposed to have some kind of validity wholly independent of its veracity, then it is not simply Israel that is under attack. It is the truth itself. It is the very notion that there is such a thing as truth, that words have definite, defined, and defining meanings, that cause and effect moves in a single and constant direction, that there is a distinction between the real and the imaginary, the things that happened and the things that did not happen, that not everything is simply a matter of interpretation and point of view and opinion, that words such as lying and false aren't just culturally determined constructs, that reality is not, in fact, a mental hallucination, that we are not living in the matrix, and that there is a natural, logical, and moral connection between what we see and what we speak, between what we observe and what we write, between the realm of the real and the realm of the mind. Without these things, as I said, civilization collapses. Contracts become meaningless. Justice becomes impossible. Social trust evaporates. The past loses its relationship with the present, and the present with the future. Without these things, the only thing that matters is power. Hannah Arendt was astute when she wrote that, quote, the aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any. So maybe this is why so many people, Jews and Gentiles alike, are so concerned about and so invested in the question of Israel's future. Big things are at stake in that little country, and they are not just about Jewish self-determination or democracy's little outpost in the Middle East. They are about the security of truth under the assault of lies, which is another way of saying that they are about the security of civilization under the assault of barbarism. Now, I am a member of a profession that likes to think of itself as a steward of the truth, much in the way that some of our friends in the Internal Revenue Service think of themselves as stewards of our tax dollars. I was going to say Congress, but I learned about my audience. And I'm often asked the question of why we in the news media so often fail to honor our responsibilities, which reminds me of a joke. A man goes to his doctor and he says, "Doc, I want you to castrate me." The astonished doctor replies, "What?" The man says, "Look, Doc, I don't want you to give me a hard time about this. I've given the matter a lot of thought. It's my life, it's my body, it's my business, and I just want you to castrate me." So the doctor agrees to perform the operation, and after the operation, as the man is coming to, the doctor says, "Well, Mr. Jones, the operation was a success. I did what you asked, but can you please satisfy my curiosity and tell me why it is that you wanted me to castrate you?" And the man answers, "Well, to tell you the truth, Doc, I'm marrying a Jewish girl, and you know, there are traditions on the matter. I just thought it was the appropriate thing to do." And the doctor says, "You mean you wanted me to circumcise you?" "That's the word, doctor." Now, I was thinking about this joke. It has a point. I was thinking about this joke over the weekend as I read various accounts of the so-called election in Iran, and of the so-called moderate who won it, and of the so-called presidency that he will occupy. Yet the words election, moderate, and president are so misleading as to leave a credulous reader of the news much in the same way as the poor fellow in my joke. Here was an election in which women and religious minorities, including Sunni Muslims, are barred from running, in which hundreds of candidates were arbitrarily disqualified, in which all the candidates who weren't disqualified are all known as hardliners to one degree or another, in which the term moderate describes a man who, in 1999, called on the regime to crush a student protest, and I quote, "mercilessly and monumentally," in his words, and in which the presidency that they are contesting is a largely powerless office, since effective power in Iran has not changed hands for 24 years, that is to say, when George H.W. Bush was president. And yet, I'm afraid to report, the media all but universally fell for the regime's propaganda that it had just conducted a regime in an exercise in electoral democracy. And the problem here lies not just with the vocabulary we use when it comes to Iran. To pick a couple of other examples, consider the use of the term occupied territories, which is now used to refer not just, and I'm speaking accurately for a change, the disputed territories on the west bank of the Jordan River, but also to the now wholly unoccupied Gaza Strip. Or again, the widespread use of the term militant as a substitute for terrorist, which might leave the proverbial man from Mars wondering if there's any moral difference between a guy who gets on a bus and blows himself up and murders a dozen or so innocent people, or those attractive Ukrainian protesters from the group Femin who sometimes bare their breasts in public in front of Vladimir Putin. In his essay on politics and the English language, George Orwell had a wonderful explanation for how this process develops. English, he said, quote, becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. That's one of the reasons why I think it's incredibly important for those of us who work in journalism to be thoughtful, very thoughtful, about the words we so commonly use. But that's not the whole problem we face. Too many journalists are historically illiterate, or what's worse, they know just enough to think they know a subject while actually knowing nothing about it. And so they arrive at such amazing conclusions as Israel being the aggressor in its war of independence when it was attacked by 5 Arab countries, and again the aggressor, they think, in the Six-Day War in 1967. Then there is the habit of journalists supposing that their obligation lies not in telling the truth of a story, but in representing all sides. I would love to meet and watch the weather forecaster who stands in front of the camera and tells you that tomorrow some people think it will rain and others think it will shine, or to more accurately reflect the nature of so much coverage of the region, that some people remember that it poured all day yesterday, but others deny that entirely, and who really is to say? And yet that is exactly how the press so often conducts itself in its coverage of the Middle East. Hamas and its jihadist allies rained rockets and mortar fire by the thousands of shells on Sderot and other communities near the Gaza Strip for years, a fact that may have had a little something to do with why Israel launched Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and Pillar of Defense in 2012. And yet that reign of terror was largely written out of the story, first by being barely reported in the press while it was happening, then by largely being forgotten by it during the few weeks when Israel decided to fight back. The worst example of this happened 11 years ago, just as I was taking the reins as the editor of the Jerusalem Post. In March 2002, late March 29th, a young, dark-haired Palestinian girl, 18 years old, named Ayat al-Akras, walked into a Jerusalem supermarket and blew herself up. Among her victims was an Israeli-American girl named Rachel Levy. That girl looked the two girls looked a bit alike, and the press had a field day treating the murderer and her victim as a kind of parable for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in which both girls were somehow themselves victims of some kind of larger tragedy. Yet lost in the coverage were two salient points, one moral, one purely factual. The moral point is that Ayat al-Akras was a killer and that Rachel Levy was a victim. One used her moral agency to deliberately take other human life, and the other happened to be a young girl with her whole life ahead of her who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The other fact is that Rachel was not the only victim that day. There was also a security guard named Chaim Smadar, a poor Jewish immigrant from Tunisia, trying to make ends meet for his children who had severe physical disabilities. Chaim Smadar physically stopped Akras from entering the supermarket with these words, quote, "You are not coming in here. You and I are going to die here together." Chaim Smadar also had moral agency, and he used that agency to heroic effect. But because he got in the way of a neat and false symmetry of the Levi Akras story, he was all but written out of most media accounts of that terrorist atrocity. And in writing him out, the press committed not only a gross disservice to the truth, but also an injustice to the memory of a humble but exceptional man. There are, of course, many other examples of the ways in which media frequently disserve the interests of truth in its Mideast reporting. And it's all the more dangerous because, as the Western press is bending this way and that to tell both sides of a story, or to make its stories fit some morally relative or value-neutral narrative, they are also serving as unwitting, at least mostly unwitting, accomplices to an even graver assault on truth. That is the assault that is coming from so-called historians, some of them at our Ivy League schools, denying that there is any historical Jewish connection to the land of Israel. It is the assault coming from so-called, I stress so-called anti-Zionists of both the far left and the far right, who use so-called, and again, underscore so-called, legitimate criticism of Israel as a front for old-fashioned anti-Semitism, in fact, old-fashioned Jew hatred. It is the assault coming from the apologists of radical Islam in the West who imagine that if only Israel would cease to exist, the conflict between the Islamic and Western worlds would go away. It is also the assault of so-called progressives who, in their fellow traveling with Palestinian radicals, have become fellow travelers with what I still think is accurately called Islamofascism. I'll never forget, in 2003, watching TV footage of those huge London protests against the war in Iraq, where someone held up a sign that said, "Queers for Palestine." I wish I could find that guy who held that sign and ask him, "Dude, do you have any idea what happens to queers in Palestine?" This is perhaps the most dangerous assault on truth, because it's the assault on the truth that Israel is the only liberal democratic state in the Middle East. No, it's not Turkey, as we've all seen in the last few weeks. No, it's not Egypt, however Mohamed Morsi came to power. And certainly it's not, quote, Palestine, where, quote, moderate President Mahmoud Abbas has somehow made it to the 8th year in office, despite only being elected in 2005 to a 4-year term. No, the only liberal country in the Middle East where there is not just political and economic freedom, but social tolerance is Israel. And yet the people we now find attacking Israel most vociferously in the West are often the same people, like that fellow in the London protest, people who imagine themselves to be on the side of liberalism and progress and personal freedom. And by the same token, the people we most often find today defending Israel and defending the rights of people in Israel, whether they're gay, straight, men or women, religious minorities or Jews of any stripe, are the people who go by the term conservative. Now, how did that happen? Maybe I would suggest to you elliptically, it's because the left in this country believes not in liberty, but believes in liberation. And liberation is liberation from whatever comes before. It is conservatives in this country who believe in liberty and understand that liberty is something that needs to be defended. One last point. not everything is bad news. The good news is that media is a plural noun. I'm proud to be a part of an editorial page that has an unbroken tradition of defending human freedom and upholding truth and speaking up against tyranny and speaking up proudly for Israel. I'm proud to have many colleagues at other papers and other news outlets who think largely as we do at the Journal, and many friends at foundations and think tanks and groups like these and audiences like these who also have the courage of these convictions. Above all, I'm proud to be a citizen of a country, the United States, where people instinctively grasp that what is at stake when it comes to Israel's security and when it comes to Israel's good, grasp what's at stake when it comes to Israel's security and its good name, and don't hesitate to take sides and to speak up. What makes America the greatest country on earth is that it recognizes that its deepest principles can be at stake in some of the smallest and most faraway countries on earth, and that it is prepared to risk everything to uphold those principles. Long may it be so. Thank you for your attention, and thanks for this award.